I came home from my sister's house on a Tuesday afternoon to find my winter coats hanging from a nail in the garage rafters and my mother's china stacked in cardboard boxes on the cement floor. Not moved temporarily, not reorganized, packed away, as if they belonged to someone who no longer lived there. My daughter-in-law was in the kitchen making a smoothie when I walked in through the back door, and she barely glanced up. "Oh, Ruth," she said, like she'd just remembered I existed. "I needed the closet in the hallway for Cooper's hockey equipment. I left you the one in your room." I set my overnight bag down on the floor and looked at her. She was already reaching for the blender lid. The conversation, as far as she was concerned, was over. What Diane did not know was that 2 years earlier, when I'd signed that house over to her and my son, my lawyer had included something she clearly never bothered to read. And every single thing that happened in the months that followed would eventually lead back to those 2 pages she'd skimmed and ignored. I need to explain how it started, because people always ask. They always say, "Why would you give away your house?" And I understand the question now, in a way I didn't then. Back then, it seemed like the only logical thing to do. Tom had been gone for 4 years. The house was a 3-bedroom Craftsman on Sycamore Lane in Millbrook, Ohio, paid off entirely, and I was rattling around inside it like a marble in a shoebox. Daniel was living 40 minutes away in a cramped 2-bedroom apartment with Diane and their son Cooper, paying rent that made me wince every time he mentioned it. The Craftsman had a separate bedroom suite on the ground floor with its own bathroom, a setup that seemed designed for exactly this kind of arrangement. I was 62 years old and still very much capable of taking care of myself, but the house felt enormous and hollow in ways that had nothing to do with square footage. Tom and I had bought it the year before Daniel was born. We'd replaced the kitchen ourselves over 3 weekends, Tom with sawdust in his hair and me painting cabinet doors in the driveway, while the neighbors watched with polite skepticism. There was a window seat in the living room that Tom built for me because I'd mentioned once, offhandedly, that I'd always wanted one. He didn't say a word, just showed up one Saturday with lumber. That was the kind of man he was. The window seat still had the same cushion I'd made for it, a deep burgundy fabric now worn pale along the edges. Daniel was cautiously enthusiastic when I brought it up. "Mom, this is your home," he said. The same way people say, "Are you sure?" when they already know the answer they're hoping for. "Are you absolutely certain you want to do this?" Diane was more direct. "It makes sense," she said. "It's a lot of house, and it's just sitting there." She said it the way you'd describe an underperforming asset, which I noted and filed away. My lawyer, Howard Chen, who had handled Tom's estate, and who I trusted completely, sat across from me in his office on the day we reviewed the transfer documents, and pushed his glasses up his nose, in that particular way he had when he was choosing his words. "Ruth, I want to include some protective language," he said. "Just standard practice for this type of transfer." I told him I trusted Daniel completely. He nodded and said he understood, and then he included the language anyway, because Howard had been doing this for 31 years and had seen more than I had. I did not read those 2 pages carefully. I should have, but I trusted my son, and I signed. The first 6 months were genuinely good. Diane redecorated the living room, which I'd expected, and I made peace with the new gray sectional that replaced Tom's old brown leather sofa. Cooper was 7 then, full of questions and perpetual motion, and having him down the hall every morning felt like a gift I hadn't known to ask for. He would appear at my door in his pajamas with a book he wanted me to read or a question about dinosaurs that couldn't wait until breakfast. The changes started small, the way they always do. Diane mentioned, gently at first, that my weekly book club was a little loud for Cooper's bedtime. I moved the meetings to earlier in the evening. She mentioned that my car in the driveway made it difficult to back out with Cooper's car seat on that side. I started parking on the street. She mentioned that the window seat cushion was really showing its age, and had she seen a lovely replacement at the home goods store. I said I preferred the original. That one she didn't press, but she remembered it. Daniel worked long hours in project management and traveled twice a month, and I began to notice that the friction was heaviest during those absences. Not dramatically, just a series of small adjustments, the kind that each individually seem perfectly reasonable. My coffee maker was moved to a lower shelf to make room for Diane's new espresso machine. My gardening tools disappeared from the mudroom and reappeared in the far corner of the garage. The mail slot in the kitchen where I kept my correspondence was cleared away to make room for Cooper's school papers. My college roommate Beverly called me one evening in March, and I found myself sitting in my car in the driveway to have a private conversation, which told us both something. "You're parking on the street and taking phone calls in your car," Beverly said. "In a house you gave them." "It's their house now," I said. "Is it?" she asked. I didn't have a good answer for that. The real shift came in April. I'd been volunteering at the Millbrook Public Library on Tuesday and Thursday mornings, running story time for the preschool crowd, a version of what I'd done professionally for 22 years before retiring. I came home on a Thursday afternoon to find a woman I didn't recognize measuring the walls of my room with a tape measure, and Diane standing in the doorway with her arms folded, wearing the particular expression of someone who has already decided how a conversation will go. "This is my friend Jess," Diane said. "She does interior design. We're thinking about converting this space." I stood there with my library tote bag on my shoulder and looked at the woman with the tape measure. "Converting it to what?" I asked. "Cooper needs more space," Diane said. "And he's going to need a homework room when he starts 3rd grade. This suite has such good natural light." I want to be clear that I did not handle that moment well. I did not assert myself the way I should have. I said, "Can we talk about this when Daniel gets home?" And Diane said, "Of course," in a tone that made it clear she'd already discussed it with Daniel and that this conversation was a formality. I went and sat in my car again. That night, when Daniel came home, we had a version of a conversation. He sat across from me at the kitchen table with the expression of a man caught between two people he loved and choosing the path of least resistance. He said Diane had some good points about space. He said Cooper was really growing. He said there was an independent living community in Fairview, about 20 minutes away, that had gotten excellent reviews. "I'm 62, I said. "It's not just for elderly people," he said, which was the single most insulting thing he could have offered. I went to bed that night feeling something I hadn't felt in a very long time. Invisible. Not unloved, exactly, but thoroughly beside the point. I thought about Tom, about what he would have said if he'd been there. Tom had been a quiet man but not a passive one, and I suspected he would have had a few direct words with both of them. But Tom wasn't there. I was the only person in the room capable of standing up for myself, and I hadn't done it. The next morning I called Beverly. She came over that Saturday with coffee from the good place on 5th Street and sat with me at the kitchen table while Diane took Cooper to soccer. I told her everything, more than I'd admitted to anyone, including the tape measure and the homework room and the parking on the street. Beverly listened without interrupting, which was unusual for her, and when I finished, she asked one question. "Who drew up the deed transfer?" "Howard Chen." "Howard Chen is thorough," Beverly said. "Did you read the whole document?" I admitted that I hadn't read all of it carefully. She looked at me with the expression of a woman who had spent 20 years as a paralegal and had seen this exact situation before. "Go find that document," she said. I found it in the fireproof box I kept under my bed, the same one that held Tom's death certificate and our old passports, and Cooper's birth announcement that I'd saved because it made me cry every time I looked at it. The transfer document was 11 pages. Howard's cover letter was clipped to the front. I'd read the cover letter and the first several pages and the signature page. I had not read pages 8 and 9. Beverly read them while I watched her face. "Howard included a life estate," she said after a moment. "You retained the right of occupancy in the designated ground floor suite for the duration of your natural life." She turned the page. "And there's a reversion clause. If you are involuntarily displaced from that suite, ownership of the property transfers back to you in full." I stared at her. "What does involuntarily displaced mean?" "It means," Beverly said, setting the document down with the deliberateness of a person who has won an argument before speaking, "that if they make you leave that room without your consent, you get the whole house back." I sat with that for a long time. Outside, a neighbor's dog was barking at something in the yard. The coffee Beverly had brought was going cold in my cup. I was trying to understand how it was possible to feel simultaneously like the ground had shifted under my feet and like something had finally, after months, become completely solid. I called Howard on Monday. He was not surprised to hear from me. "I wondered when you'd find those pages," he said. "You could have told me," I said. "I did tell you," he said gently. You said you trusted Daniel and asked me to keep it simple. Keeping it simple and protecting you were not mutually exclusive, so I did both. I asked him what my options were. He walked me through them in the same calm, systematic way he'd explained everything since Tom died. I could assert my right to stay, in which case they could not legally remove me from my suite without my written consent. I could negotiate a settlement in exchange for voluntarily vacating my life estate, and that settlement would need to reflect the fair market value of my interest. Or I could invoke the reversion clause and reclaim the property outright. What's the value of the life estate? I asked. Howard quoted a figure that sat somewhere between eye-opening and quietly satisfying. I did not mention any of this to Daniel or Diane. Not yet. I needed a few days to decide what I actually wanted, which turned out to be the harder question. What did I want? I sat in the window seat with the worn burgundy cushion 2 evenings in a row and thought about it honestly. I thought about the way Cooper appeared at my door in the mornings and how that would look from a new address. I thought about the garage and my mother's china on the cement floor, and Diane measuring my walls with a tape measure. I thought about the fact that I had spent 6 months making myself smaller in a house I had given away out of love, and smaller still in the months before that, after Tom died, trying to take up less space in a world that felt like it had reorganized itself without me. What I wanted, I finally admitted to myself, was not to win. I didn't want the house back. I didn't want to make Daniel choose sides or disrupt Cooper's life or blow up a family over square footage and a closet. What I wanted was for someone to see me, to acknowledge that I was a person with preferences and a history and a right to exist without apologizing for it. And then I thought, if I'm going to insist on being seen, I should probably be willing to look at myself clearly too. I'd given them the house, in part, because I was afraid. Afraid Daniel would take Diane's hint and move somewhere else, further away, and I would lose access to my son and grandson. I had used my own home as a tether. That wasn't love. That was fear dressed up as generosity. On Wednesday morning, I got up before anyone else was awake, made coffee in the kitchen, and found Daniel sitting at the island in the early gray light, staring at his laptop with the exhausted look of a man who hadn't been sleeping well. He looked up when I came in. "Mom," he said, "I've been wanting to talk to you." "So have I said. I put a mug of coffee in front of him and sat down across from him and set the deed on the counter between us. He looked at it without touching it. "What is this?" "It's the transfer document," I said. "Specifically pages 8 and 9, which I should have read more carefully 2 years ago." I gave him a moment. Howard included a life estate clause and a reversion provision. Daniel pulled the document toward him and read slowly. The color in his face changed in a way I hadn't seen since he was a teenager and realized he'd been caught in something he couldn't talk his way out of. When he finished, he set it down and looked at me. "I didn't know about this," he said. "I believe you," I said, because I did. Diane handled their legal documents the way she handled most things in their household efficiently and without unnecessary consultation. "Mom, I'm sorry," he said. "I'm sorry about the closet and the measuring and all of it. I let things go further than I should have." He stopped. "I've been telling myself it was compromise, and it wasn't." I looked at my son, who was 40 years old, and still had the same jaw as his father and the same habit of pressing his lips together when he was ashamed of something. I had been so angry at him for months, quietly, in ways I hadn't fully acknowledged. But I looked at him across that counter in the early morning light, and I felt something unclench. "I used the house to keep you close," I said. "That was my part in it. I wasn't as selfless as I told myself I was." He didn't argue. He just said, "What do you want to do?" "I want to find somewhere that's actually mine," I said. "Not a shared arrangement, not a suite in someone else's house. Mine. And I want to be compensated fairly for my life estate in exchange for giving it up voluntarily." He nodded slowly. "And if I can't get Diane to agree to fair compensation?" I tapped page 9 of the document. "Then I'll have a conversation with Howard about the reversion clause." That afternoon, Daniel talked to Diane. I was in my room with the door closed, not trying to hear, but the house was old and the walls were what they were. I heard Diane's voice rise, and then, gradually, go quiet. I heard Daniel's voice stay steady, in a way I hadn't heard from him in some time. The conversation between the three of us happened that evening at the kitchen table. Diane sat across from me with the expression of a woman recalibrating, which to her credit she did fairly quickly once it was clear that the legal ground was not what she'd assumed. She asked Howard's figure, which Daniel had relayed, and disputed it. I expected that. I had my own calculations, which Howard had helped me put together, and I slid them across the table without heat. "This is what it's worth," I said. Not to be difficult, because it's accurate. We went back and forth for an hour. Diane was sharp and I had expected nothing less. But I was a 62-year-old woman who had spent 22 years as a school librarian, and school librarians are almost universally underestimated, which is a professional advantage I have relied on more than once. By the end of the evening, we had reached a number. Not everything I'd asked for, but enough. Enough to buy something that was mine. The morning after we signed the paperwork, I drove to Cartwright, a small town 40 miles east, where Beverly had mentioned a cottage for sale on a property near a creek. She'd seen it listed online and sent me the link with no comment beyond just look at it. I looked at it. 2 bedrooms, 1 bath, a screened back porch that faced the water, a kitchen with original 1940s tile that I found inexplicably charming. The price was what it was because the property needed work, a new roof within the next few years, and a kitchen faucet that had been dripping since the listing photos were taken, and a garden that had gone entirely to meadow. But the bones were solid and the porch was perfect, and when I stood in the backyard and looked at the creek and the old sycamore tree on the bank, I thought, this is where I should be. I put in an offer the next day. The weeks of packing were strange in the way all endings are strange when you're inside them. Cooper helped me wrap my mother's china, piece by piece, carrying each plate to the box with the concentration of a child entrusted with something important. He asked about each pattern, where it had come from, who had used it. I told him about my mother's Sunday dinners and the particular gravity with which she'd served pot roast on those plates, and he listened with the complete attention that children are capable of before they learn to perform listening instead of doing it. "Will you still have room for me at the new house?" he asked at one point. "The whole 2nd bedroom is yours," I told him. "I'm getting you a set of bunk beds." His face arranged itself into an expression of pure satisfaction that I wanted to keep somewhere. Daniel came by most evenings to help. He and I talked more during those 2 weeks than we had in the 2 years since I'd signed the house over, real conversations, about his father, and about his own marriage, and about the choices we both wished we'd made differently. He told me that Diane had said something that surprised him, the night after we'd agreed on the settlement. She'd said, "I think I've been managing this household like a project and forgetting that your mother is a person." He told me he thought that was probably the most honest thing she'd said about the situation. I told him it was a good start. On my last evening in the Craftsman on Sycamore Lane, I walked through each room after everyone was asleep. The window seat was still there, the cushion worn pale along the edges. I sat in it one more time and looked out at the dark street and the maple tree that Tom and I had planted in the first year we lived there, now enormous, its roots beginning to lift one corner of the front walk. I had worried about that walk for 3 years, and now it was someone else's concern, and I found the feeling was lighter than I'd expected. I brought Tom's window seat cushion with me. I couldn't not. The Cartwright cottage needed almost a month of work before I could move in fully, so I stayed with Beverly during that time, which was the happiest month either of us could remember in recent years. We stayed up too late and talked about everything, and I helped her with her garden, and she drove me to the cottage to check on the contractors, and we ate dinner at the diner in town 3 times a week because Beverly knew everyone there, and being known felt like a luxury I'd forgotten. The contractor was a man named Earl, whose crew fixed the roof and the faucet and the sagging step on the back porch, and asked careful, respectful questions about my preferences without assuming he already knew them. His neighbor, Frank, helped me carry boxes when I finally moved in and stayed for coffee afterward, and turned out to have read more books than anyone I'd met in years. He'd retired from teaching high school history and had opinions about everything, and didn't require me to have the same opinions, which I have found is a rarer quality in people than it should be. Frank and I started taking walks along the creek path most mornings, which became the thing I looked forward to most about each day, which I noticed, and chose not to think about too carefully for a while. Daniel brought Diane and Cooper to see the cottage on a Saturday in June. The sycamores along the creek were fully leafed out, and the garden was beginning to show what it was capable of under some attention, and Beverly had dropped off a cake she'd made because Beverly always has a reason to make a cake. Cooper ran straight to the creek bank without asking permission and stood there watching the water with his hands in his pockets, looking more like his grandfather than he had any right to at 8 years old. Diane stood on the back porch and looked out at the water and the trees and the light coming through them, and then she looked at me and said, "This is really lovely, Ruth." It was the first time she'd called me Ruth instead of a careful you or a pointed Daniel's mother. I don't think she knew she'd done it, which made it mean more. "I know," I said. "It is." That evening, Beverly and Frank joined us, and we sat out on the screen porch with plates of food and the kind of conversation that moves between people who don't need to perform for each other. Cooper fell asleep on the porch swing before dark, and no one mentioned moving him because he looked too comfortable, and none of us were ready for the evening to end. Daniel sat next to me and watched the creek, and at one point reached over and put his hand on mine for a moment without saying anything, which said everything. I had spent the better part of a year feeling like I was disappearing, like I was constantly adjusting myself to fit into spaces that kept getting smaller. And then, because a lawyer I trusted had included 2 pages I hadn't read carefully, and because I'd finally decided I was worth the trouble of standing up for, everything had rearranged itself into something I hadn't imagined when I was standing in a garage looking at my mother's china on a cement floor. Frank leaned over at one point and said quietly, "How are you doing?" in the way that meant he actually wanted to know. "Honestly," I said, "I'm doing better than I have in years." He smiled and looked back out at the creek, and I thought about Tom, who had built me a window seat without being asked, and how the truest mark of someone who loves you well is that they pay attention to what you need before you've learned to ask for it yourself. Somewhere through the screen, a heron landed on the far bank of the creek and stood there in the fading light, absolutely still, like it owned every inch of the world it happened to be standing in. I knew exactly how it felt. Before we wrap up, if this story resonated with you, make sure you're subscribed to Tales of a Roaming Wolf. I share new stories every week, and tomorrow's is one I think you'll want to hear. Stay with us,